transformational technology, and inspirational leaders. I'm your host, Connor Sherman, and this is the Confident Defense Podcast. And welcome back to the Confident Defense Podcast, where every week we sit down with VCs, CEOs, and security executives to have these really honest conversations about how we as security and technology leaders can win this infinite game of cybersecurity. And today is a really incredible episode. So we've got a treat where we've got Stefan joining us as our co-host, and we have a pretty incredible guest. Our guest today is Andy Shoemaker. He's an expert in denial of service attacks. He's also the founder of NimbusDDOS. His company helps enterprises, governments, and cloud-native companies prepare for DDoS attacks by performing both risk assessments and, get this, performing and launching controlled real-world attacks against their infrastructure. I'm super excited to dive into this. We've got a ton of topics to talk about. Andy, welcome to the show.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this. This will be great.
I'm looking forward too, because Stefan and I have been talking about this too, as he's out helping his clients, and DDoS, ransom DDoS extortion has been on a rise this past year, and it just kind of exploded. So when we were talking about off camera, we're like, why don't we get an expert on the camera, come on and have a conversation on the podcast? And so I reached out to you and I'm like, please, let's understand, let's get our hands around what is the state of these denial of service attacks? What is the state of these ransomware DDoS or DDoS extortion attacks that we're seeing? So with that, I was hoping you could just kind of level set us with just basically some terminology, understand the state of play, and then we'll talk about what's going on right now in the world of DDoS and the risks associated with them.
Yeah, so just as a quick kind of level set, just so that everyone kind of knows what I'm talking about when I start throwing out crazy acronyms and whatnot. DDoS attacks, first of all, it's basically any cybersecurity attack that makes it so that somebody can't get to your online resources. Now, that's sort of a general term. What a lot of people think of it as is when an attacker basically targets somebody's website and makes it so that the website won't load. But really, it can be anything. DDoS attacks can target, VoIP systems so that your phone systems don't work properly. They can target, gaming platforms so that you can, not access your favorite games, or it could be a website or some other proprietary software or whatever. So, in a nutshell, it's any attack that makes it so that a resource becomes unavailable. And that sort of that differs from a lot of other cybersecurity threats where the goal of the attacker is to, it's to gain access. It's to, take your data, take that data somewhere else, maybe sell it to somebody or use that data in some nefarious way. For this type of attack, people don't need special access to your environment. So it's not like a traditional break-in type of cybersecurity threat. And so as far as like the current landscape, the interesting thing about DDoS attacks is there seems to be, at least as long as I've been involved in it, there seems to be this natural like ebb and flow of DDoS attacks where there's some sort of, cyclical nature to it. And it absolutely seems like we are in an upswing pretty much ever since COVID started, but really starting at the end of last year, going into the beginning of this year, up until now, where really there seems to be this big uptick in ransom-related DDoS attacks, and that's really fueled a lot of business on my end, but also a lot of rattled nerves from our customers that, of course, are tasked with handling these problems as they pop up. It's been a pretty challenging year for a lot of enterprises.
Well, it's been a very challenging year for a lot of enterprises for a lot of reasons. And I was wondering if you could break down a little bit more about maybe some of the why COVID specifically has impacted clients in this way. Why companies that are out there right now over the past, we'll say year and a half or so, have started to see some of this increase outside of the normal seasonality.
I think there's, just like anything, there's probably a million reasons for it, but I think there's a couple big bullet points that really kind of make this situation happen. First, I think you have people globally where there's a higher number of people that maybe are under or less employed than they were before the pandemic. So
That's fair.
there might be people who were formerly employed as technical people that maybe are out of work, and they're finding other sources of revenue. And then I think the other piece that's sort of interesting is just that the targets have changed a little bit. Like back when everyone was going to offices, the target of a DDoS attack would be the corporate website or some other sort of public endpoint. But now that target has shifted to things like remote access endpoints, VPN endpoints, and things like that. So those resources that previously weren't as important to an enterprise now are, overnight they became instantly the most important thing to the enterprise because you don't have any productivity. And the problem with that is that a lot of those resources, especially VPN endpoints, weren't terribly well secured against this type of threat. So it opened up this huge new hole where previously people didn't care about a DDoS attack against a VPN endpoint, and now it's like it shuts down productivity for everyone in the company. Big problem.
I completely agree. I just think about that. I was like, like that just the VPN endpoint, the remote access endpoint. Like you just don't in a traditional DDoS conversation. That's not part of it, right? It's like we're talking about the e-commerce platform. We're talking about the thing that is the public, like you go to such and such.com and that's what you see. But you're right. It's all this other infrastructure that we rely to take care of the business. That's also a target here as well.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that a lot of the mitigation solutions out there were sort of built around the notion of protecting those public endpoints like a website and the things that people commonly associate with a DDoS attack. They weren't necessarily put in place with the notion that they would be protecting remote access endpoints.
Right.
That's a little bit unusual.
No, I mean, I don't think I'm going to shock anyone by saying, when you think about, standing up your traditional firewall for that VPN access, that stuff barely holds up as it is, So when you put anyone starts to throw real traffic at it, it kind of falls on its face, whether, whatever the brand is, Palo Alto or Cisco or Juniper, it's just not designed for 10 gigabits of traffic hitting it on the front end. It's meant
if the circuit will even support.
Yeah.
If the circuit doesn't support and you can shut down the pipe, then it doesn't even matter what's hitting it on the backside.
And actually, I think that's a really interesting thing. Andy, can you help me orient my world around DDoS attacks? Because you mentioned there's a seasonality and it's matured over time. But when I think DDoS, I always think volumetric attacks. And I've said it 3 times so far in the show. It's can you put more data through the pipe? But I don't think that's the whole story, right?
No, it's not. And the common misconception, even amongst highly technical people, even within the cybersecurity field, is that DDoS attacks are about sending a whole bunch of junk traffic down a circuit and overwhelming that circuit. But that couldn't be further from the truth. A DDoS attack could actually be very tiny if it's constructed properly. So you could target maybe you could perform a small number of web requests to maybe a very sensitive application, and by sending some data that passes on through to a database server that maybe constructs some very bad queries on the back end, that could maybe take that database server and make that become unavailable. So in essence, what you've done is you've created a denial of service attack, but maybe only sending 100 requests per second, something really small. So it doesn't even really show up on the bandwidth coming into the enterprise because it's such a small amount of traffic. But because it happens to hit that right thing that happens to be very sensitive, boom, the whole thing just blows up. And that comes down usually to architectural issues in the environment with how they've structured their applications, where there might be these sensitive points.
Overutilization.
Yeah.
Along the pipe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that becoming more of a problem as people have kind of thrown their apps on the internet? Are you seeing those layer 7 attacks that create more, or is it just there's more exploitation of these poorly designed or unscalable solutions?
There's a mixture, right? So layer 7 attacks definitely are on the increase. The vast majority of attacks in the wild are still like the volumetric, big UDP floods or amplification attacks and all these things that eat up bandwidth. But over time, those layer 7 attacks have continued to kind of grow year over year. But it's maybe like 20% of attacks are layer 7. So it's a smaller number. What's interesting about that is, well, I don't know if there's a smoking gun per se that points towards why that's increasing, but I have a theory. And so my theory is that as more companies start to add in mitigation protections within their environment, it sort of forces the attacker to go towards those layer 7 attacks, because those are the attacks that are harder for mitigation vendors to actually block, because they're much more deceptive. Like they actually look like real traffic.
Legitimate traffic.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Yeah, because I imagine it's like a login page to a thing and you take that down. Or as you mentioned, some back-end constraint. It doesn't take much to make it fall on its face.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine if you have a vendor who is looking, let's say that they're looking at the traffic coming in through a 10 gigabit circuit, and you're sending just 100 kilobits of bad traffic. I mean, they're never going to find that. It's going to look, not only are they not going to see the anomaly on their traffic graphs, but the traffic itself is usually encrypted, so they can't even open up that traffic stream and look inside anyway. So in many ways, those mitigation vendors kind of have their hands tied because of security in other areas like encryption and all these other things that we enjoy.
Got it. Now, there is, like we mentioned at the top of the show here, this idea of like there's an increase in extortion, and COVID's been there. And I blend the two, which is this DDoS, ransom, DDoS extortion. First of all, am I wrong to do so? Are we talking about the same thing? And then B, what are you seeing as you're working with your clients, as you're seeing, you have this view of the world? Basically, here's my thought. When my GC comes to me and she has a question about this, I'm like, okay, this is important, right? When it's not me going out to the board to talk about what we're doing against these mitigation, trying to educate them. They're coming to me and saying like, hey, I'm reading about this risk. Like, what are you doing about it? So there seems to be this sense in the industry that this is getting traction. Its impact is noticeable. There's lots of media buzz around it. So what are your thoughts on this, on what's going on out there? Like, what are some of the shifting dynamics around these extortion campaigns?
Well, I mean, honestly, the, DDoS really, so just sort of to set the stage. So the very first denial of service attacks, those date back to like maybe 1995. I mean, denial of service attacks are a very old sort of attack that have been around forever. And historically, the way that people use those attacks, it was primarily for sort of personal vendettas, where maybe some people on chat services and stuff like that, they would go after each other. Yeah, exactly. And it was just to really just piss off your friends or enemies. And that has modern equivalents where people do that in the gaming space and so forth. But
that's right, yeah.
Yeah. but the reality is that doesn't account for like the large volume of attacks. And what really triggered that sort of overnight change was really the explosion of a way to monetize the DDoS attacks. Before that, you basically had personal vendettas, which was the motivator, or maybe you had hacktivism, where you had people like Anonymous, where they were going after financial institutions, and they wanted to put out a political message, a statement with the attack to try and change public opinion or sort of punish those enterprises. But the big change was when you started having things like Bitcoin. Then there was suddenly this monetization of DDoS attacks that you could make. And it's a monetization that goes two ways. You have first the monetization from people who are doing the extortion, where they basically say, hey, if you don't pay me, I'm going to take your company offline. And then the other monetization is with the DDoS botnets for hire, where somebody will run a botnet that can perform these DDoS attacks and basically sell access to that to people that might not have the technical skills to do so. And so, they're sort of getting money from both sides, the people that operate these botnets. And that, I think, really explains the growth. And that really just happened as Bitcoin and other virtual currencies started exploding DDoS kind of followed along, just like with ransomware. Like ransomware wouldn't have actually existed if it wasn't for the way that you can monetize it, right? Like nobody would go around and encrypt people's files, unless there was a way to make money off of that.
Yeah, actually, on that note, there was early in my career, we had just deployed, we'd gone through this huge McAfee upgrade. And I was going through this, and this was like way back in the day. Like ransomware wasn't really a thing. Like it was just getting started. It was still like trying to figure itself out, like how the market was going to work. So we put this thing down, and I put this thing, and I had this little protocol I put in there around don't let people talk over the IRC protocols. It's like there's just no need for that in this financial services company. And like, thank God I put in that little policy, a little checkbox. It just said nope, because the one time it ever flagged was somebody clicked the dropper, down came the ransomware. It tried to encrypt, and the first thing it did is it tried to use the IRC protocol to send it back, and it just like boop, and we just stopped the key from leaving, and the whole thing fell on its face. Like, but you're and that was early, like I don't know, I forget, like 8-9 years ago, but you're right, like there was no sense of that market hadn't matured yet because the crypto, the funding for it hadn't been there. So like the Bitcoin in the world hadn't been widely adopted. So it sounds like that's the economic force that's changed DDoS.
Well, I'll tell you, your example is also the proof that sometimes being lucky goes a long way in cybersecurity.
Yes, it does. I remember doing that. I walked up like, holy hell, like I just got really lucky in that policy, right? I literally just made the decision one day because I was just going through this upgrade. I'm like, this seems reasonable. Click, then stopped a whole ransomware event on our trading floor because of that.
I can only imagine. That would be a nightmare.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's one of those things we could chat all day about is the nightmares of security that you can see out there. Yeah. And it's definitely a good combination to have both some luck and obviously some skill on your side.
Yeah.
Well, and how many people just don't even know what IRC is? So being well informed enough to understand that we can do some mitigations there.
Yeah, that's where being an old school guy like myself comes into play because I think a lot of maybe folks that are newer towards technology, these days there's so many abstraction layers that are put on top of the network stuff that we do, whether you're a developer like doing engineering or whether you're a network person. There's so many abstraction layers that some of those very basic things, which is what DDoS and in many cases other areas of cybersecurity kind of look to exploit. It helps to know those things. So when I'm looking at a packet capture, you're looking at the raw details. You got to know your stuff when you're looking at the raw packet stream. That's but right. I think a lot of times that stuff sort of gets lost these days because a lot of people don't really need to look that deep into the communications these days.
I think you're right because there is such a big focus on layer 7 that oftentimes layer 3, 4 is so far abstracted away that I talk to plenty of developers and you say, hey, is this TCP or UDP? I don't know and I don't care. It works.
Yeah, yeah, you're spot on. I have friends that work at some of these large tech companies, like the Googles and the Netflixes of the world and stuff. And when they develop code, I mean they don't know any of the underlying stuff that's happening because it is so abstracted. Which it's great. I mean it facilitates the amazing technological advances that we have, but at the same time, it means that some of those low level things that attackers tend to exploit, they kind of go unnoticed.
And for anybody listening, I want you to know that we're not saying one is better than the other. We're saying both are equally important, and you should explore the other routes to be a better security practitioner.
Yeah.
So yes. we already went back in time a little bit. We talked about IRC. Let's talk a little bit about time travel a little bit more. And can we jump into your journey into the world of DDoS mitigation? So what was was it you frustrated one day? Was it an opportunity that you saw? What was the click, the light, the turn on, the flame? What got you going down this route?
Yes. So DDoS is one of those things that I've been interested in it since I saw the first source code for a SYN flood back in 1995. I remember seeing the source code pop up on some security mailing list, back in the day. And,
NetSec, anyone? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so it was, the full source code for a SYN flood. And I didn't really know a lot about it. I mean, I was kind of a curious person. And, from that day on, I kind of started sort of investigating DDoS attacks. And, obviously I did experiment around a little bit with them in my, in my personal time.
Over a 14.4 modem, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. But the reality is, my professional career, I went more towards the technical operations. So I went the traditional kind of system administrator, managing large networks, large systems, things like that. And I was in that pathway for many, many years. Like I worked in online gaming companies. I worked in, large media companies. And then at one of those companies that I was working at, I was the manager of the team, and I'd only been there for like a year. And just one night, we were just about to leave the office. Me and one of my coworkers, we were about to go out and grab some dinner, and all of a sudden, we get all these alerts. Our phones are blowing up because the main site is down. Like, and this is a big media company. Like, if I mention the name, you'd absolutely know who I'm talking about. And so the whole site was down, and so immediately, everyone scrambles. We start logging in, start looking at what's going on, and that I don't really know much because I'm new to the team, but I'm trying to help out, poking around. And one of the things I happened to do is I happened to bring up a packet capture, and I discovered that it was a denial of service attack. It was a UDP flood. And the rest of the team, even though they were very highly skilled systems and network people, they had actually never seen a denial of service attack. And these are people with 15 years of experience in networks. It's just that was an area that they didn't know. And so as the manager, of course, I was like, well, what do we have to fix this? And the answer was that we didn't have anything, which was terrifying, being only at the company for like a month. And so, under sort of duress, we ended up calling up a mitigation company and basically trying to get mitigation very quickly put in place for our environment. So we signed this contract, and, it had terms that we really didn't even look at because we were in such a panic. And we were able to get the service onboarded within just a couple hours and get the attack mitigated very soon after that. So, we were probably down for a few hours, but at the end of the day, we all sort of collectively breathed a sigh of relief. And, we were just like, problem solved. We won't ever have to worry about that again.
And then,
well,
it's like, I'm like, I think something's coming next.
Yeah. So, fast forward, probably like 8-9 months later, basically the same scenario happens where all of a sudden our pagers go off one morning, and, we start looking around, and again, we're experiencing another denial of service attack. And this time it's actually a layer 7 attack, not a UDP flood. And we detected it because we had seen in our web logs that there was this huge spike in, requests coming into the website that was like, 100 times the normal background request rate. And, we immediately activated our mitigation solution, and nothing happened. And so, of course, as the good manager, I called up the vendor and just started screaming into the phone irrationally. And and what I discovered was that mitigation solutions aren't really a silver bullet against DDoS attacks. It's really just a tool in your arsenal. And that's actually the aha moment for when I came up with what Nimbus does, which is to help companies test. So anyway, that's the very long story of how I got from point A to point B.
It's amazing how many security CEOs I talk to, and they're like, well, why do you build this company? It's like, well, because I spent 10 years trying to solve for this thing and it didn't happen. And so I'm like, fine, someone's going to go build this thing for me. So I'll do it myself.
Yeah.
Because that's a huge problem though. Like, because you just, how do you throw a gigabit per second, 10 gigabits per second of traffic at what you like? You just can't tabletop that. You do need to test it. We can't properly tabletop it unless you have the ability to test it. And so it's a rare thing to see out there.
Yeah. Well, and the reality is that before public cloud came around, with like Amazon and GCP and Azure and such, there really was no way to test this because as a technician at an enterprise, you don't have enough resources at your disposal to launch an attack against your own infrastructure. So you really have to use outside resources. And so for a company like mine, let's say if I was trying to start up my company back in like 2000 before cloud stuff happened, I would have had to have massive data centers with just a unlimited supply of servers doing the attacks. But the reality is now that there's cloud computing, I can have resources scattered throughout the globe that are basically simulating that same botnet that a real attacker has. So that couldn't have happened even back then.
Well, the good news is we've all moved to the cloud, so now we're protected from DDoS, right? Isn't that we're good now? Or is that not necessarily the case?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. I don't want it to sound like a bunch of FUD or anything like that, but there is the notion that if you use a large vendor, whether it's a cloud vendor or like a large ISP, and you host your services with them, that they are somehow going to protect you. And the reality is that it's not really their business to protect you. And this again is one of those historical things where it goes back in time quite a bit. So at one point, back in the late 90s, I ran a web hosting company, and for whatever reason, so it had web hosting, but it also had chat services like IRC and stuff like that. And it used to constantly be the target of DDoS attacks, where I would be the victim of it. And I actually ended up back in the late 90s getting kicked off of multiple providers because I was the victim of DDoS attacks, not the source of it, the victim. And that's something that still continues to this day. And in fact, there's even been, people, most notably, the security journalist Brian Krebs, a few years back, he was the victim of many DDoS attacks, and he had mitigation services through a mitigation vendor. And eventually they just decided it wasn't worth the hassle, and they basically just kicked him off the service. And so that's a mitigation company.
So the mitigation company or the cloud providers are kicking off the victims because it's cheaper for them to lose one customer than to potentially impact all these other customers because it's shared infrastructure. Is that basically the idea?
Yeah, in a nutshell, yeah, that's basically it.
Holy crap. So what do you do as a security leader, right? Like you go to these cloud providers and you're paying gobs of money every month to host all your stuff, and then they're going to turn around and remove services.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a little bit of the exception. Because the reality is that most enterprises aren't going to be attacked at the same level that a journalist who's exposing cybersecurity criminals is going to be attacked, right? Like he's going to end up being attacked literally every single day.
And some of those attacks were like top 10 biggest in history when they were hitting him, because why not?
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's an extra $30.
Yeah, exactly. So when those attacks were happening, I'm sure he was so anomalous that it was just such an extreme situation that really nobody at any of these mitigation companies could have foreseen that it was going to be that extreme. And again, I mean, they have to sort of look out for the, their bread and butter, which is those enterprise customers. If they have an Oracle or some other big company that's relying on them, they're not going to want to try to explain to that company that they had an outage because of this journalist who's exposing cyber criminals in somewhere. Like that's just not an acceptable answer. So I totally get their viewpoint, by the way. But it sucks for somebody like him, who's basically the victim of it all.
Especially when you look at layer 3, layer 4 rerouting and scrubbing, those vendors are usually paying by traffic quantity.
That's true too. Yes. Yeah.
So if you suddenly have a massive amount of flood coming through, they literally have to put that over their own pipes. It's their traffic, and that. So sure, scrubbing is hard, but it's the traffic moving inbound that is so challenging.
Well, and even going back to the item that Connor, that you mentioned about the cloud resources, that's the other piece. Is even if the cloud vendor, like Amazon or Azure, somehow does block the traffic or absorb the traffic, well, you're still paying for it as a customer. So if there's a 10 terabyte attack hitting you, you're going to get a really big bill from Amazon at the end of the month.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So we've talked a little bit about about volumetric attacks. We've talked about a little bit about layer 7 attacks. What are some of those big TTPs that are being used right now? So anybody that's listening to this, what do they need to know about some of these attacks in order to start doing some mitigations, or at least exploring the the landscape of providers that are out there?
Well, I mean, the thing that makes the headlines is those, it is basically those giant, you know, uh, DDoS attacks, right? Like you
The
hear
big one.
about the 2 terabyte attacks or something like that, and those make for great headlines. But the reality is that most day to day DDoS attacks are actually quite a bit smaller than that. Which that does, obviously it means the attackers have some limits on their ends as well. But yeah, the thing that's sort of emerging right now is enhancements to the botnets that drive these attacks. So in many cases, the attacks themselves, the vector hasn't changed. Like the UDP flood that I saw back in early on in my career, or the SYN flood from back in like 1995. That attack still is a very common attack today. And I mean, here we are, like 25 years later or whatever. And that's sort of unusual in the cybersecurity world, right? Like a lot of times, cybersecurity is, you expose a vulnerability, it gets exploited, and then it gets patched. In the case of these DDoS attacks, the attack still maintains, and what ends up changing over time is sometimes you get new vectors, like maybe you'll get a new amplification attack that comes out or something like that. But more importantly, the way that the botnets that run these attacks, how those develop, that's usually what changes. So right now, there's a new botnet called Maris, which is basically exploiting some weakness in consumer routers. And so you have all these consumer routers that are basically getting broken into all throughout the world, that are now then launching those same SYN floods or UDP floods that are 20 years old. But the
Right.
mechanism for that spread, that worm-like behavior where it spreads all throughout the globe, that's the innovative and new part. And that's usually what dictates, I think also some of that ebb and flow that we talked about earlier is dictated by the spread of those.
So the ability to generate a botnet versus the actual exploitation itself.
Yeah, because the botnet sort of has a lifespan to it because it relies on devices being susceptible. So it might be a bunch of servers that run a vulnerable version of WordPress, let's say, or maybe it's a router that has some bug that somebody discovered. Those are eventually going to get patched, or enough of them are going to get patched where the botnet becomes very small. And what the botnet operators are always looking for is that next big exploit, so that they can then recreate their botnet where they've got a couple 100,000 nodes at their disposal.
Got it. Okay, so if I'm putting myself back in my CISO shoes here for a second, it's like what's changing? What's changing the risk profile here is that the adversaries' economics are changing. It's getting easier for them to exploit Internet of Things. It's getting so they have more of a computational footprint. They can go consume bandwidth from somebody else elsewhere, and then you've got that plus the ability to do the payments for the extortion. So then you've just got this almost like infinite supply of ammunition,
Yeah,
and a super simple way of doing the commerce. It's like their go-to-market strategy as an adversary is getting easier and easier and easier. That's what I'm hearing.
Well, I mean, literally, if you're talking about it purely from an economic standpoint, or looking at it from a business standpoint, like the commercial side of things, it really is almost the perfect business to be in, aside from the risk of maybe getting arrested, because there is no cost to doing it, right? Like as an attacker who's running a ransom DDoS campaign, the cost is basically your time in sending out emails and maintaining this botnet, but you're not paying for those resources. They're all stolen resources. They're all hacked machines and all that stuff. So it's 100% profit. Like if somebody in, Eastern Europe, gets $50, it's $50 profit. There is nobody else that's being looped in on these things.
It's interesting. And I mean, you mentioned so the Maris, and Maris has just, I believe that's the one that's related to the same botnet that Cloudflare just clocked in as the highest DDoS that they've ever mitigated. And there was something like what the metrics, again, big metrics here, 17.2 million requests per second. It
Yeah.
was just like mind-shatteringly huge, but again, it was based off of insecure consumer equipment turns into a botnet, and then the adversary just points it at whomever.
Well, and that sort of illustrates one of the well, what's interesting about these things is people think of it as like, oh, it's this consumer botnet that's maybe a couple 100,000 hacked routers that are on people's residential internet connections. Mm-hmm. What that really is a good indicator of is the fundamental nature of how DDoS attacks can impact the internet. Because at the end of the day, your connection to the internet, whether you're a large enterprise, whether you're Google or Amazon or a Fortune 500 company with a couple data centers, even though you think you're big, you're tiny compared to the whole internet, right? The whole internet is always going to be bigger than your connection, no matter how big you are.
Yeah, good point.
Right? So like, if you compare the size of Google or Netflix, they're giant. But if you compare them against every residential connection in the whole entire world, they're dwarfed by it. And that's where the DDoS attacks really, can really rough up some companies pretty badly.
I want to jump one more bit before we move on into Maris, because I think when we were looking at it, it's the first time that I have seen, the first time that I have seen that I know of where a Russian company actually sinkholed like 1/5 of the botnet itself, and it was Rostelecom that did that. So interesting that, to me at least, that usually we see this from Five Eyes type countries that are out doing that work, and now we're starting to see it from Russia as well. So just one point I wanted to highlight there, that not something that I would have expected, and kind of refreshing to see. And I'm interested to see where it goes.
Well, I think there's a reason for that, though. It's because the target of the botnet at one point was Russia's equivalent to Google. What is it, Yandex or something like that?
Yandex, yeah.
Yeah, so
that makes more sense now. Thank you for bringing up speed.
That's it's amazing when your customers complain and it's a big customer.
Oh, when it comes down to dollars.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that small thing. Yeah. It's like, okay.
But honestly though, even if that wasn't the case, I think you do see with those large attacks, there is a lot of cooperation. Maybe not initially, but usually once things start to become larger performance problems that start having tentacles throughout other aspects of the network, where you might have peering points that are starting to see stress and strain, you usually do see ISPs starting to sort of work together to fix that. And you'll see those sort of communications happening, even in like network operator forums like Nanog and stuff, where people might identify things that are going on, and like even though they're at competing telecom companies, they will work together to try and clamp down on that stuff, which it's great. I mean, it's an optimistic sign for the resiliency of the internet.
Sure. The internet's resilient. You may just be crushed along the way if you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
So which kind of brings me into my next thing, which is just kind of, as a CISO, as a CIO, as a technology leader, what are some of the common oversights, right? Like, of the risk portfolio that we're constantly managing, of the technology we're bringing to protect ourselves? Like, what are some of the things that you, in your experience, you see people forgetting about, not paying enough attention to? What could we be doing better to handle this attack category?
Well, I think the big thing in the DDoS space that would help people the most is, I think it's probably related to the human element. And but I guess there's two pieces. People always think of DDoS attacks as primarily like a technical issue where they have to get some sort of service that will block the attacks. And that's very true. Like having those tools in your toolkit from a mitigation vendor, very beneficial. But the thing that people always forget is that DDoS attacks usually have a much broader reach across an enterprise. So a lot of times there's the human element of how to actually do that incident response. So even though you might have mitigation from like Cloudflare or Akamai or one of these other providers, they don't operate in a vacuum. You actually need to have incident response people in-house that are knowledgeable, at least at a basic level, about DDoS attacks. And more importantly, they need to know what's normal for your applications versus not, so that you know whether it's being properly mitigated and stuff. And then the other piece is, and I guess it's really related, is that there's the process component around that. A lot of times people forget about the process elements of handling an incident. So a lot of times people go into this reactive mode where they just immediately start trying to fix the problem because you want to get back online as quickly as possible, and you forget about some of the things like communicating to your customers. There's like a PR element to it. Maybe there's a post-mortem element to it where you want people that are collecting data so that you can look back at the incident and understand why things failed the way they did. And having that information. So a lot of times those things get overlooked, and they're, I would say, potentially more important even than the mitigation system. And we frequently see failures in companies when we do testing where they have mitigation systems in place, but because of failures in the process and human side of the equation, we're still able to actually cause an impact in their environment.
So I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, you can't forget the fundamentals of have an incident response plan, have a procedure for this, do a tabletop. Because like one of the things that came up for
rehearse.
Proactive.
Prior planning and preparation prevents symptoms of performance. Yeah, something like that. So I think there's something really important about that. Because like one of the things that I've seen come up, and I'm sure to say, like really tactically, it's that you pay for the packets that hit AWS. Like you're paying for that. If you've got a mitigation tool in front of you, like a lot of security teams, they log the requests that are denied because they want to see what traffic was done. And so you blowing up your SIM over here while you're trying to handle this, and you deny it. So you're paying for this huge cost as a premium, and you're not going to do data analytics on that. You know what happened. You're under a DDoS attack, right? It's the same packet over and over again. So there is that sense of understanding. Great, we go through, like going through as you were describing there, go through the runbook. Okay, we have it. It hits our Cloudflare or Akamai or whomever. Where does that packet go? Or where does that log go? Oh, do we have to make sure we turn that off while we're under attack? Like, are there kind of those secondary impacts that we want to manage so we don't have $1 million logging bill at the end of this whole thing?
Yeah, well, it's funny that you mentioned the logging piece because, one of the most common failures that we see is if a company doesn't have mitigation from like an upstream vendor, like these routed solutions, then usually what ends up happening with, say, a UDP flood is it gets dropped by the edge firewall. Well, you can imagine if you're sending, 1 million packets per second to an edge firewall, and every one of those packets is getting dropped and logged, you're basically generating 1 million logging events per second. And so what we've seen during some of our testing is those things just absolutely explode. And the issue that creates, of course, is that then people debugging the attack, the incident responders, they now have no access to they don't have access now to one of the most valuable tools that they have in their arsenal, which is the SIMs and the event management systems, because those have been completely blown out of the water. And of course, the attacker never planned on doing that. Like that wasn't their intent, but that's what happens.
Absolutely. And so I think the other thing I want to just get your insight on is so we talk about, you can overlook the procedure component of this. You can overlook the incident response playbooks, so on and so forth. What about the application layers? Like we mentioned this kind of top of the podcast, where when you're thinking through design, when you're thinking through building your systems, what are your thoughts around that?
Yes. So, I think I actually started answering it at one point, but then I went off on a crazy tangent. And the thing with the application level attacks is that, and this actually ties into another question that I think I sort of scooted around a little bit, which was,
Mm.
Are you protected in Amazon? And people always ask, am I protected in Amazon? Well, the thing is, if you build an application that is horizontally scalable, then DDoS attacks actually can be weathered decently in those sort of systems. Now, the problem with horizontally scaling is that it takes time. So you might have
Yes.
a load balancer that horizontally scales to handle millions of requests per second, and that would handle all the attack traffic. But the problem is it might take you an hour to scale out to that level. So you might be down for that whole time. But anyway, to answer the question, when you're doing application design, if you can make the applications where all the different layers are horizontally scalable, that goes a long way to mitigating a DDoS attack. Now, you're not blocking the traffic. All you're doing is you're absorbing the traffic. And so, with like a web application, if you can get away from using like, kind of old school, like monolithic database design where you have, just a single database that's running all of your websites or something, if you can get away from that and go to more horizontally scalable components, that makes a huge difference. At the end of the day, though, it is not a cure-all, though, because an attacker still can send quite a bit of traffic, as we talked about before. So you usually do need something upstream of that maybe has even more capacity, like one of the scrubbing services or something like that, and let those eat up that traffic for you.
Along those lines of who or whom might be working to scrub that for you. So for anybody that out there right now that doesn't have a really solid plan for DDoS, what are some of the steps that we should take? Like, when do you want to evaluate a company for DDoS? When do you want, like, let's start jumping down that preparation standpoint, because I think that's really, we've got some rubber meets the road in addition to horizontal scaling. But like, what else do we need to do? How do we get those?
I know when not to do it. Don't sign the contract under duress. Don't prepare while you're under attack. I think I got that one.
Yeah.
Whenever preventable. Yes.
Yes.
You never want to sign the contract when you got a gun to your head. That's for sure. Well, let's sort of take a step back and talk about, I guess, mitigation systems. So, there's, to people that are not familiar with DDoS mitigation, there's really two different major umbrellas of mitigation platforms that are out there. So the first is what you call a proxy-based scrubbing system, and this would be something, you can think of it as like a CDN, like a content distribution network, where it's a whole bunch of web servers that are scattered throughout the globe, and the idea is that those are intelligently deciding on what traffic goes back to your data center. And so there's a lot of operators in that space, very well-known names like Cloudflare has their proxy-based solution. Akamai has their Kona product, which is like their CDN that also does, scrubbing of web traffic. Imperva's got their Cloud WAF product. There's many vendors in that space. And they all sort of function on that same premise, though, where they receive the web request. They look at that web request based on all the data that they have at their disposal, and then they make a decision on whether to pass that through to your web servers or to block it. I mean, that's, at the end of the day, it's that simple. Now, the complexity is how they do that, and they all have their own different ways of doing that. But fundamentally, that's all it is. The second type of solution is what's called a routed scrubbing solution or a network scrubbing solution. And those products normally are meant to protect, your actual physical data center, where you're scrubbing all the traffic that's going into that data center. And so the way that those normally work is you actually adjust your routing to send the traffic through a third party. And again, there's many players in that space as well. Akamai has their Prolexic product. Cloudflare has Magic Transit. Imperva's got Encapsula. A10 has, I forget what they have. They've got a thing. F5's got Silverline. There's a ton of them. But they all basically work in a similar way, where you route all of your traffic through them, they then look at like the layer 3, layer 4 information on the data streams, and they decide what traffic to send through to you versus blocking. Now, the challenge with those solutions, as we kind of alluded to earlier, is that because those are looking at packet header information, they really can't make good decisions when it comes to blocking layer 7 attacks. And in most organizations, they usually have a combination of the two, where they'll have the data center getting protected by the layer 3, layer 4 solution, and then they'll have that proxy solution in front of all their web apps to protect those for layer 7 attacks.
Belt and suspenders.
Yeah, belt. Yes.
Got to do 1 through 7. You can't do half the thing.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So that means like we'll both protect the pipe, make sure your layer 3 and 4 stays clean, and then protect the app, make sure up to 7 is taken care of. It's gonna.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, if you don't have anything other than web applications, then in theory you could get away with just doing the proxy-based protection. But there's a lot of enterprises that they can't completely isolate their office networks or their data center networks, where they have to have things like video conferencing, or maybe they have some proprietary VPN solutions, right? Like a VPN solution can't be protected by one of these proxy solutions. It has to be protected by those network layer ones. So it's really just about how your organization's structured, which solution is the best fit. And actually, that's one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give people that are watching, is that there's a lot of vendors out there, and I wouldn't say that any of them are necessarily good or bad. They're good or bad depending on which type of company you are. Like, some vendors match up really well with certain types of companies. And then other ones, they don't work at all for that type of company. Like they it's like oil and water. They won't mix together. That's where you start seeing some of the differentiations between them, is how your organization interacts with that vendor that you're relying on.
And you couldn't be closer to the truth in my mind. So one of the roles that I got, the very first project I had to work on was an active DDoS. And so here I am. I'm working on this client. We're trying to get to yes. We bring another vendor in that we know. We bring them in, and 90 seconds in the conversation, and I didn't know this at the time, that vendor only did layer 7.
Yeah.
And these guys, they had to do layer 3, 4, and you'll appreciate this. The gentleman that was their architect at the time had written some of the RFCs for BGP.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So like, that's not a fair fight. Okay, great. How are we going to do this? And yeah, it was a very interesting, fun project, and I learned a lot on it. And I'm wondering now, kind of as we transition, from the red team perspective, because you're effectively a red team partner here.
Yep.
What are we looking at? What are some of the more popular techniques that you're seeing, maybe that you use, or that you see other people in the space use?
Normally what we do when we put people through like a battery of testing, we normally hit on whatever the most common attacks are in the wild at that time. So right now, there's sort of a mixture of old, and then I guess you could say they're new, but even they're sort of old in a way. You certainly have like the ongoing thing with like DNS amplification attacks, very common attack. NTP amplification, very common for the last 10 years or so. SYN floods, UDP floods. But in this most recent group of attacks that are associated with this ransom campaign that started at the beginning of the year, fragmented IP floods have started coming back into fashion for some reason. And honestly, I'm not even sure why, because the attacks, it's an old attack, like it's been around for a long time. I think maybe they just put it in there because it's easy to put into the botnet. It's fairly easy source code. So maybe they just put it in there and figured, hey, let's give it a try. And surprisingly enough, when we actually ran some of our customers through that, a decent number of mitigation vendors didn't successfully block it. So the attackers might be onto something, where even sometimes old attacks, they can still sneak through. Because a lot of times what it comes down to is whether or not the configuration that you have with that protection vendor, whether that's actually set up appropriately. So a lot of times, just like with firewalls, you'll see misconfigurations of those vendor services causing gaps in coverage. So you might be paying through the nose for some protection service from a vendor, and it's just not working the way it's supposed to because the thresholds are set 10 times higher than they should be, or something like that. And of course, that's where we kind of come into play, and we can help people test their solution and stuff like that.
I love that. I love that. And I'll go back to one of the quotes that Dr. Johannes Ulrich said in a SANS course that I was in years ago, was that we don't learn from our old mistakes. So I don't know, maybe it's just an engineering thing and the audacity of building new systems that goes along with it. But one of his favorite things to do when he's testing new systems is, you're going through and incrementing your packet sequence, and he goes, yeah, and sometimes we'll just decrement on a number and see what happens. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 3. It falls over.
Port knocking anyone? Yeah.
So let's transition a little bit more, and talk about the preparation. So, with many of the clients that I work with, especially in like the e-commerce, the retail, and the nonprofit sector, they've got the calendar year quarter 4 is one of their biggest giving seasons. So, and I know that when I talk with them, one of the things that we talk about is, we know that you're in retail, you're in e-commerce. We can expect that of your peers in the space, X number % are going to be hit with a DDoS.
Yeah.
Let's figure out, does it make sense, and how are we going to do that? What is that? I was wondering if what other seasonality do you see out there? And am I right? Am I wrong? It's okay. You can hurt my feelings. That's normally what I have seen. That's limited to my experience and my reading.
Yeah.
What other seasonality do we see out there? We talked a little bit about waves overall, but quarterly.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I mentioned before was less. It was less about seasonality, and it was more about just kind of normal ebb and flow of how technology, people discover weaknesses and whatever. But I think you're right, though. There is a seasonality to it, because we certainly have customers that are in the e-commerce side of things as well, that they do a fair amount of preparedness work leading up to the holiday season. So, and of course, they can't actually test once they're actually in that season.
Quarter 4 is we have a freeze period. We can still develop, but it's not going out of development.
Yeah, so we end up doing a lot of testing in Q3 for those type of customers because they're doing last minute preparation. The other one we've seen that's I wouldn't call it a seasonality, but it is a time dependency, is anything where there's actually a timed event occurring. So the classic one, of course, is like the Olympics, right? Like everyone needs to prepare for the Olympics or whatever. We had one where it was sort of a major event in a country, and the country contacted us to do a big 100 gigabit attack to test the circuits going into the country. So it's a small country, but country nonetheless. And the whole reason that they had that was because there was a specific event taking place on a specific day, and they wanted to make sure that they really had everything buttoned up. Similar to that, in the online gaming space, when you talk about gaming like sports betting and things like that, that timed element, that's one of the big reasons why those companies get exposed to so much DDoS attack, is because, if somebody wants to mess with that, all they have to do is run a DDoS attack for 10 minutes, and hey, that's all
enough
they
to cause damage.
Yeah. They don't have to, like with a sort of traditional brick and mortar business, they might have to run that DDoS attack for a week for it to really cause the same level of pain that for that specific business only takes 5 minutes.
Gaming is such an interesting industry. I've got a few clients, and it's constant. Like the landscape changes so fast. It's fun.
It's a very interesting world. So some of the companies I worked at previously, they did online casinos, online poker, online sports betting, things like that. So it's a very interesting world to be in.
When fight night turns into a different kind of fight.
Yeah. And the other one that we saw, which is also, I think, very relevant, is there's sort of a political seasonality to things as well. So, news outlets, for instance, leading up to the last election, we had a lot of news outlets that were concerned about DDoS attacks because, leading up to elections,
Yeah.
people get kind of heated. And next thing you know, there's DDoS attacks against, some major publisher of news, right? So we do quite a bit of that preparedness as well. So I think it's important for most companies to look at their business and see if there's any of those timed elements in that business. It might not be as clear as it is in e-commerce, but I think every business has some component that there's a peak and non-peak, and it's important to identify that.
That's a really good insight. And I hope everyone kind of resonates with that. It's like, again, it goes back to this larger theme as security leaders, knowing your business. Company A is not the same as company B. I'm just thinking now, where I'm at right now, there is a peak moment in every day where the site needs to be that much more performant. The ability for customer support needs to be that much more responsive to service the customers in that unique space, which is completely different than what we had in finance, where it really was around, these were publicly traded companies. So every quarter things were coming out and we had an increase in attacks trying to get into steal non-public information to help with trade running and stuff. So every company is different. And I really like that insight of understanding the timing of the business and protecting that.
This is where I wish I didn't have NDAs, because I have some really great examples.
I know, right?
But alas, we do, and so we shall. But on that note, I want to change gears. We ask every guest 2 questions, and we want to get your thoughts on these. So I'm going to open the first one over to Stefan, and then I'll catch us with the last one and close this out for our conversation today.
Now, Andy, so I spent a lot of time mentoring kind of the next generation of leaders in this space. And with that, they ask for career advice all the time. And I try to make sure it's relevant to them. And I want to know, relevant to you, what is career advice that you would have given yourself 10 years ago? So Andy, now, advice to you 10 years ago, please.
I think if you're going to be in let's say you're taking the entrepreneurial route like I did, or even if you're going to a larger business, I think really being comfortable and challenging yourself to sort of step outside of the comfort zone. And I think that's especially true of technical people, right? A lot of technical people tend to be very introverted, myself included, and I think it's important to sort of force yourself to get out there and sort of push yourself, because, to be in that sort of, either entrepreneurial position or leadership position, you really do need to sort of embrace that, maybe, that other side of your personality. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of personal growth that people can get by, pushing into those other areas that they're maybe not comfortable with.
I think that's very fair. And just finding what are the areas that we're not comfortable with, because there might be a reason you're not comfortable with that. Leading it a little bit. And my question to you, Andy, is what is an innovation in our industry that you really wish that security leaders or technology leaders would lean into and adopt? If there's one innovation that you're really passionate about, you wish people would just kind of operationalize into their security programs, what would that be?
Since I'm so embedded in the DDoS world, I always, my focus is always on scalable design, right? Because a lot of the issues that people have, it's because they don't take a modern scalable approach to designing their applications and such. So for me, sort of through the lens of DDoS attacks, that's one of the ones I often come back to, because the people who sort of feel the biggest brunt of this stuff are people who run more traditional application stacks. Right. And obviously you can't change things overnight, but if you're developing anything new, look to it with that new lens of doing things in a scalable fashion and looking for growth, even if you're actually not expecting a certain level of traffic, just because it can help you from a risk standpoint for things like DDoS attacks.
That makes perfect sense. Scalability solves a multitude of sins.
If I can answer twice, actually, the other one would actually be application monitoring. Is the other thing. You would think every enterprise on the planet does a good job at application monitoring, but they don't. And frankly, if you don't know that your applications are broken, you've already lost the battle, whether it's a DDoS attack or whether it's just an outage caused by, bad code. Like at the end of the day, you have to know whether your stuff is working or not. And it just blows my mind that that's still like an area of weakness. So things like any sort of APM tools that dig in and get detailed performance metrics about different aspects of your performance of your stack, very, very helpful. Not just for DDoS, for everything. So very enthusiastic about that area.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. You cannot protect what you cannot see. Full stop. Oh, cool. Well, guys, I could talk about this stuff for hours. Andy, you were an incredible guest. So Andy, Stefan, thank you for what is an incredible conversation today.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.
And for everyone else who's listening today, please remember to connect with Andy on LinkedIn. So you'll see that on the thing as Andy Shoemaker, and or jump over to the website NimbusDDOS.com and connect with him there. If you are looking to get a handle on DDoS, if you want an honest conversation, if you really just want to get your hands around what it looks like to prevent and prepare for DDoS ransom and DDoS extortion, have a chat with Andy about that. So until next time, we'll see you back here at the Conflict Defense Podcast. Thank you both.